Jake leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. He had stayed late at the office, poring over the financial reports of his restaurant chain. The numbers were promising. Naturally, there were issues that required his attention, but that was just part of doing business. Overall, his restaurants were thriving, which was indeed encouraging. Years ago, Jake could only dream of a hearty meal as he struggled with hunger. Now he was wealthy, with a successful business and substantial bank accounts. He could afford to travel the world, drive luxury cars, and wear designer clothes. Yet the trappings of a luxurious life didn't appeal to him. Jake found fulfillment in giving back. He took pleasure in using his wealth to make others a bit happier. He regularly donated to funds for medical treatments and sponsored several orphanages. Most of these institutions were in the capital, where he had lived for over 20 years. Nonetheless, he didn't overlook the orphanage in his hometown. Often he reminisced about his early years. They reminded Jake of his journey from hardship to strength. In addition, his story constantly reminded him that many children in the world have similar struggles and need support. His own children, Billy and Annie, are now old enough to discuss serious matters. Jake has already shared his life story with them, including the hardships he faced at their age. Despite their privileged upbringing, Billy and Annie were sympathetic towards less fortunate children, and that brought their father great pride. Jake was wary of spoiling his heirs excessively. He didn't want his son and daughter to become indifferent and self-centered. He had already seen enough of such offspring of wealthy families, their permissiveness, indifference to others' misfortunes, and belief that the world revolved solely around them. Jake strived to raise Billy and Annie to be compassionate, empathetic, and attentive. His wife, Alberta, supported him in everything. They both grew up in an orphanage. In general, Jake went to an orphanage when he was 9 years old. Before that, he grew up in a loving family. They lived frugally, but they were never impoverished. They had a clean, cozy 2-bedroom apartment and an old car, which Jake's father used to take the family on trips to the river or the mountains. Jake's mother worked as a painter, while his father laboured in a factory. As a child, Jake never pondered about their financial situation. He revelled in his peaceful, sunlit childhood, cherishing his relationships with his parents and friends. Jake's parents never argued, at least not to his recollection. They never raised their voices at him, even when he made mistakes. They always spoke to Jake as if he were an adult, explaining the consequences of his actions and the potential outcomes of recklessness. In response, Jake strived not to disappoint them, took responsibility for his actions, excelled in his studies, and refrained from causing trouble. "Remember, there are only 3 of us in this world," his father often reminded, "and we must look after and protect each other." Jake cherished these conversations. To him, their family resembled a close-knit team, Mum, Dad, and him. They were each other's fortress. Jake knew his parents had both grown up in an orphanage. Occasionally they would share stories about those years. Jake would listen captivated. Their childhoods were starkly different from his own. They'd had indifferent educators, hostile peers, and lived in constant hunger. No one cared for them. Jake felt fortunate to have loving and understanding parents. The thought of ending up in an orphanage himself was unimaginable. He had parents who loved him dearly. The only thing missing was grandparents. He saw his friends enjoying their company, savouring Grandma's homemade cakes, and embarking on fishing trips with Grandpa. But such is life. His parents were the best, regardless. Jake would always remember that warm summer day. He was riding his bike to his house. The cool shade would give way to bright sunlight and warmth. The smell of heated herbs filled his nostrils. His loyal friend, Ralph, was beside him, sharing jokes and stories. But as Jake noticed the crowd of neighbours at his entrance, his heart filled with dread. Jake instinctively knew that his parents were in trouble. This morning they had left to the local market for the fresh and healthy produce, as his mum put it. Jake often accompanied them, enjoying the mini vacations. He relished the peacefulness of the car rides, the scenic view of the fields and hills, and his parents' soft chatter. The village, with farm, market itself, held a unique charm, including a distinct smell that his mother disliked, but Jake somehow enjoyed. It was home to various animals, horses, cows, and goats, which fascinated Jake, though they were commonplace for the local children. But that day, Jake had chosen to stay home. His friend Ralph had invited him to ride bikes in the new park, which had special paths and a newly opened fountain. Jake's parents, always considerate of his wishes, had agreed. "Fine, stay home if you like," his mum had said, ruffling his hair with a smile. "We'll bring you something tasty," Dad promised, settling into the driver's seat. Jake nodded happily. He and Ralph stood at the entrance, waving the adults off, unaware that this would be their last goodbye. It was a marvellous day. Jake and Ralph explored new paths, met other kids, played in the fountain, climbed trees, played with a stray dog, and chased pigeons. Summer vacation was indeed the best time. However, that afternoon divided Jake's life into before and after. Looking for his parents in the crowd near his house, the boy suddenly noticed the anxious and worried faces of his neighbours. And then one of the neighbours finally saw Jake and Ralph. He alerted the others, and soon about a dozen pairs of eyes were fixed on the boys. Jake immediately felt a shiver run through him. Mrs. Weston, the best friend of his mother's and a frequent visitor to their home, was the first to embrace Jake. "There's been a tragedy," she said, looking into his eyes. "You must be strong." The neighbours informed Jake that his father had lost control of the car, which then careened into a ditch at high speed. A hole in the road, previously unnoticed and hence unattended by road services, had caused the accident. The dangerous area was now cordoned off to prevent further accidents, but it was too late for Jake's parents. They had both died in the crash. The news was difficult to comprehend, let alone accept. His parents were his rock, his constants. Jake fainted from the shock. When he came to, he was at Mrs. Weston's house. She had called an ambulance, and the doctors gave him an injection. Everyone looked at Jake with sympathy, patting his head and hugging him, but their compassion only made him feel more frightened. Jake didn't think about his future. He was in a strange state, disconnected from his surroundings. Everything around him seemed to slow down, and he felt like an observer in his own life. The neighbours arranged the funeral, while Jake stayed with Mrs. Weston, reluctant to return to his now empty home. The woman sent her children to her in-laws temporarily and stayed close to Jake, crying when she thought he couldn't see or hear her. She tried to be calm around him, but it seemed forced. Jake did not attend his parents' funeral. The night before, he had a frightful tantrum, screaming, sobbing, convulsing. This terrified both Mrs. Weston and himself. Jake was taken to the hospital, given medication, and tranquilized. Afterwards, everything seemed unimportant. The boy lay in his hospital bed, staring at the white ceiling. Days later, Jake began to feel better, and Mrs. Weston was allowed to see him. "Jake, you'll have to live in an orphanage for a while," she said in a trembling voice. "But I promise I'll visit you." Jake shuddered. Until now, he hadn't considered where or with whom he would live. His mind was overwhelmed. The mention of an orphanage alarmed and frightened him. How could this be happening? His parents, who were raised in an orphanage, had often told him how fortunate he was to be born into a family, and now he was destined for a similar institution. Tears welled up in his eyes. He tried to hold them back, but to no avail. Mrs. Weston tried to console him, promising to visit him often, and even take him home for the weekend if the orphanage management permitted. But at that moment, Jake understood that he was now alone. His wonderful support system was gone. He would have to navigate his new path on his own. although at the time he had no clue about the challenges he would face. In retrospect, it's worth noting that Mrs. Weston and other neighbours did visit him. Mrs. Weston visited most frequently, always bringing gifts. She used to embrace Jake, asked about his life, but over time, these visits became less frequent and eventually stopped. The boy wasn't offended. He understood the situation entirely. He had to mature quickly, realizing that people were busy with their own worries, not the concerns of a neighbour or a young boy. The orphanage was situated outside the city, so the children didn't attend a regular school. Instead, the teachers came to them. On his first day, Jake was attacked by the local boys to assert their dominance. Some girls watched and giggled maliciously. When the tutor arrived, drawn by the noise, the girls claimed that Jake had fallen down the stairs, and the boy was reprimanded by the tutor for his supposed clumsiness. "You know, you did good, not complaining or tattling," one of the bullies later said. "If you had said something about us, we would have beaten you up even more." Jake didn't respond. He hadn't kept silent from fear of further punishment, nor out of a desire to protect his tormentors. It was simply that he knew the tutor wouldn't care or offer any help. Life in the orphanage was difficult and dreary. Adjusting to it was tough. A small private bedroom was replaced with a dormitory housing 10 beds. Instead of his mother's delicious home-cooked meals, he had to eat unappetizing porridge. He was met with indifference and often hostility, rather than acceptance and heartfelt conversations. There were no friends or kind, smiling neighbours here. Jake was immediately disliked. For 9 years he had been a favourite child, and now he found himself among children who had never known such comfort and love. Many of them had endured difficult lives and held a belief that those more fortunate owed them endlessly. Therefore, physical abuse became part of Jake's life, making each day unpredictable. He tried to stay unnoticed by his tormentors, but it was impossible when they all shared the same sleeping quarters. Treated with cruelty, he was doused with water, tripped up, insulted, spat on, and had objects thrown at him. Yet he had no choice but to endure it all with patience. Jake attempted to befriend the other children, not out of fondness, but to make his life more bearable. However, he found it difficult, as these boys from the orphanage, hardened and only understanding the language of force, were vastly different from his friend Ralph. As his schooling began, Jake was surprised and frustrated to discover that the lessons were superficial, with his classmates' academic level exceedingly low. Jake, who had always been a good student, found himself standing out right on the first day. His classmates struggled with basic tasks and had difficulty reading. Finally, a smart student, such a pleasure to work with. The teacher praised him. Jake smiled, pleased to be noticed and spoken of positively. However, that very evening, he was confronted by a group of boys in the backyard. The girls, as always, kept their distance and silently approved. "Think you're the smartest, huh? Don't show off," the boys said with threatening in their voice. Jake was hurt, offended and scared, but he learned his lesson well. He stopped showcasing his knowledge in class and started making deliberate mistakes on tests to avoid standing out. Alberta was in the same class as Jake. She belonged to no particular group of girls and was friends only with those as quiet as her. They often found themselves the targets of their peers' cruel jokes. And Jake quickly realized girls could be even more cruel than boys. They invented such insults for Alberta and her friends that he would cringe. They also ruined their belongings, forced them to take on their duties, and took away the treats given to the children in the canteen. Occasionally, fights erupted among the girls in the yard, featuring biting and hair-pulling. The educators would separate the children and indiscriminately punish them all. Some children, however, were left untouched. As Jake later realized, certain teenagers were simply too intimidating for the adults, and it was easier to punish the quiet ones like Alberta, even going so far as to lock her in a dark storeroom for 24 hours. Jake also spent time in that storeroom, often for no discernible reason. He found it strangely comforting, though. It was quiet and dark, a place where no one bothered him. A couple of years passed, and Jake and Alberta became close friends, even developing romantic feelings for each other. Jake changed during this time. He grew stronger and more resilient, learning to stand up for himself. Much of this change was due to Alberta. It was painful to watch as the other girls bullied her relentlessly, and Jake couldn't take it anymore. One day, he saw how the girls were harassing meek Alberta again, and he stood up for her. He was fully aware of his actions. The girls were initially surprised, then they started to laugh, not just chuckle, but outright laugh. The strongest amongst them pushed Jake back against the wall. The impact was strong, but Jake held his ground and pushed her back. He knew it wasn't appropriate to hit girls, a principle he learned in kindergarten, but in front of him wasn't a girl. It was a monster, a vile, malevolent, merciless one. Then all the girls, who usually resolved conflicts through verbal and physical fights, attacked Jake. Despite being alone, he fought back effectively. The truth was that Jake had been training secretly for quite some time. He used a flour sack in the storeroom as a makeshift punching bag. He did push-ups and pull-ups. He decided to adapt to the rules of the game. If survival in this world meant being the strongest, then he had to be the strongest. "Fool, you're in trouble now," warned one of the girls, the recognized leader of the group. And Jake knew exactly what their threats implied. They would tell their friends everything, and retaliation for his audacity was imminent. Trouble was certainly on the horizon. But Alberta, she looked at him like a hero, a savior. Under her gaze, all looming problems seemed to fade, losing their importance. "Thank you," she whispered. "But what will you do now? They will come after you." "It's all right," Jake assured her. "I'm not afraid of them." At that moment, he truly wasn't afraid of any reprisals. It didn't matter to him. All that mattered was the special way Alberta was looking at him, and her smile. Of course, payback caught up with Jake, and very soon. "What? You've become the coolest?" asked one of his attackers. But the question was rhetorical. Jake was severely beaten, while the girls around suggested various ways to humiliate him. This time, however, Jake fought back a little. He managed to land a few solid hits before he ended up on the ground. His retaliation surprised the attackers, who were used to a passive victim. After this, they occasionally attacked him in groups, but never alone. Breaking away from the memories, Jake sighed, stretched, and turned off his computer, thinking, "It's time to go home. Tomorrow I can sleep longer. Spend time with your family." The man donned a coat and left his office. His car was parked behind the restaurant, near the trash cans. Suddenly he spotted a poor elderly woman next to him. Dressed in shabby clothes and old sneakers, she was a picture of poverty. Instead of shooing away the homeless, Jake instructed his staff to leave untouched food in containers on the special table near to the bins. He always felt a deep compassion for the destitute individuals. Upon detecting Jake's presence, the poor woman turned to face him, her eyes reflecting anxiety as she studied his approaching figure. As for Jake, he was dumbfounded. This old woman, no, this is simply impossible. But she was very similar to the woman who had once played a key role in his life. The man scrutinized her face, and she was also looking at him, studying. Years ago, while residing in an orphanage, a remarkable event had occurred in Jake's life. A new teacher, Mrs. Fuller, joined their institution. On her first day, the class tested her mettle with cruel jokes, attempts to disrupt the lesson, and even outright insults. Most teachers would either succumb or lose their temper, but Mrs. Fuller responded with an unexpected sadness and pity. Jake, who as always was ashamed of his classmates, watched Mrs. Fuller with interest. She was an extraordinary figure, a fact he promptly recognized. The new teacher conducted a very engaging lesson with animated video. Initially, the students chuckled and attempted to jest, but even the most indifferent and disruptive ones eventually engaged. At the end of the lesson, Mrs. Fuller started asking questions. To Jake's surprise, he knew all the answers. As he responded, the teacher nodded in approval and smiled, seemingly impressed by his competence. She hadn't anticipated finding such a capable student here. No longer fearing jabs from his peers, Jake answered freely. Mrs. Fuller asked him to stay behind after class. "You're an incredibly talented boy," she complimented Jake when they were alone. The boy realized that the teacher had intentionally refrained from praising him in front of his classmates to avoid stirring up envy. He was struck by her wisdom and sensitivity. "Thank you," he responded. "You clearly need to study in a different program. Your level is much higher, and it could be even higher," said the teacher. "I've seen many kids, and I can recognize ability instantly. You're very capable." "Thank you," Jake replied again, both embarrassed and delighted. It had been a long time since anyone had paid him much attention. "Tomorrow I'll bring you another textbook. You should pursue more serious topics." True to her word, the next day Mrs. Fuller brought a bright, colourful textbook. "We'll review the material with the other students for now. You don't need it. Read this, then tell me what you understand and what you don't." Jake immersed himself in the reading and didn't notice how quickly the lesson passed. "Well, did you understand something?" Mrs. Fuller asked with a smile, leaning over the desk. "I understand everything. Just didn't have time to finish reading. It's a shame, it's interesting." "Take the book with you. You'll have time to finish it. I bought it for my daughter, but she doesn't seem interested. It will be useful to someone at least." Mrs. Fuller enriched Jake's life, making it happier and more meaningful. The other children also liked her very much. She was a unique teacher who connected with her class not through humiliation and strength, but through clear explanations and heartfelt conversations. Both boys and girls were drawn to her. However, it was clear that Mrs. Fuller had a soft spot for Jake. Yet no one objected anymore. His classmates noticed Jake's remarkable progress in the subject, and that he always helped them and never refused anyone, even those who had recently bullied him in the backyard. Jake eagerly read one book after another that Mrs. Fuller provided. Later, the teacher gave the boy a player with several discs. Reading is one thing, listening is another. Listening to serious podcasts can be a bit challenging, but you'll manage, I know. "Thanks, but only—" Jake eyed the player with doubt. "Such a thing is expensive. It's not guaranteed that the boys won't take it away. I'm afraid I can't accept it." Mrs. Fuller seemed to understand everything. "I'll arrange it with the principal. He'll allow you into the classroom at certain hours, after school, when no one is here. That way you can study. Does that work for you?" "Of course," Jake replied cheerfully. It was delightful to do his favourite subject in the serenity of an empty classroom. It was not only about learning, but it also provided a great opportunity to be alone with oneself. Privacy. That's what Jake sorely missed at the orphanage. And here it was perfect. Now, Jake often conversed with Mrs. Fuller, not only about lessons, but they also became almost like real friends. Jake shared with his teacher the story of his tragedy. It felt good to share moments from the past with a sympathetic person. The woman shook her head, occasionally sighing. "Oh, it's been hard for you, Jake." Conversations between the teacher and the capable student weren't always serious. Sometimes they laughed and joked, discussed the news, debated, or delightfully found common ground. It was all quite engaging. One day, Mrs. Fuller suggested that Jake participate in a regional competition. The task was to write an essay on the topical issue. "Your imagination is excellent and your language skills are top-notch. You can do it," she said. "I don't know." Jake expressed his doubts. After all, he was just an orphan boy. Other kids had homes and received tutoring. How could he compete with them? "I know. You'll succeed," Mrs. Fuller confidently reassured him. She was persistent, and Jake started working on his essay, finding the task captivating. Alberta assisted with the design of the project, and to everybody's surprise, the essay won the prize and advanced to the next level of the contest. Unlike previous stages, this one required participants to be in the capital. The format was as follows. Each participant goes on stage and receives a task from the jury to compose a speech on a certain topic. Quick thinking, improvisation, and imagination were key. "You can do it! You can definitely do it!" Mrs. Fuller paced around the classroom excitedly. "You can win! I know it! And there's a prize, a ticket to the future. Free tuition at a boarding school for gifted children. It's a prestigious school. First, the most prestigious universities queue up for graduates from there, and then employers. You have every chance to such a future." Jake, already contemplating his future, understood the importance of participating in the competition. The thought filled him with both anxiety and excitement. He feared he might not be up to the task. "I will prepare you," Mrs. Fuller assured him, as if reading his thoughts. "You are more deserving of this opportunity than anyone else. We'll study diligently, and you'll do fine." "These lessons aren't enough," Mrs. Fuller fretted. "We need to study on weekends as well. I'll speak to the principal about you visiting my house for additional lessons. You have immense potential, but you need a solid foundation. With hard work, everything will fall into place." The principal agreed, and even allocated funds from the orphanage's budget for bus fare. It wasn't a large sum, but it helped. For the first time in years, Jake found himself alone in the city. He boarded the correct bus and took a free seat. It was exhilarating to travel so freely through the city, gazing out the window. Mrs. Fuller met him at the bus stop. It was a little surprising to see her out-of-school office, but also pleasant. Their way passed through the public garden. They talked, laughed, joked. Jake suddenly imagined that he was just an ordinary teenager, walking next to his aunt or even his mum. They're discussing something, smiling. It's a typical picture. The people around them have no idea that this is what happiness looks like. To them it's all just normal, ordinary life. Yeah, it's wonderful how strange and complicated life is. "Here's my house," he said, looking at the nondescript 7-story building. It was a standing dwelling, similar to where Jake had lived with his parents. Mrs. Fuller's apartment was familiar, mirroring his parents'. 2 bedrooms, a small cosy kitchen, living room. Mrs. Fuller wasn't wealthy, evident from the simple furniture and inexpensive wallpaper. Yet there was a warm, comforting atmosphere. Jake knew his teacher had a daughter, Ellie, his age. He was excited to meet her, imagining she must be as interesting as her mother. He hoped to befriend her, as he had few friends in his life. Mrs. Fuller seldom shared much about her daughter. They discussed an array of topics, but never about her. This made Ellie a mystery to Jake. However, as soon as Ellie walked into the apartment, Jake realized they would likely not be friends. At that moment, Mrs. Fuller was explaining complex topic to her student at the kitchen table. The kettle was boiling, an apple pie was baking in the oven, and Jake was looking forward to a pleasant tea party. Suddenly the door rattled open and a teenage girl appeared on the threshold. She wore a daring miniskirt, displaying her long thin legs with sharp knees, a tight top, and thick platform shoes. Her short greasy hair was dyed an odd green colour. Her large eyes were heavily lined with black, and her eyelashes were coated with thick mascara. Jake looked at the girl in surprise. He had pictured Ellie differently. Not exactly Jane Eyre, but certainly not like this. This image of Ellie reminded him of the aggressive girls from the orphanage. It wasn't just her appearance. Yes, maybe she liked this image, and everyone has the right to express themselves, but it was more than that. It was her cold, prickly gaze, her contemptuously pinched lips, and her deliberately swaggering movements. "Hello, Ellie," Mrs. Fuller smiled at her daughter. "This is Jake. I've told you about him, remember? He's preparing for a contest." "Hello," the boy waved at her. Ignoring his greeting, Ellie turned to her mother with a haughty look. Is there anything to eat? I won't be long. Yes, Mrs. Fuller bustled around, rushing to the refrigerator. I'll eat in my room, Ellie declared, then left. Soon loud pop music came from Ellie's room. A few minutes later, the woman went to her daughter's room with a plate of pilaf in her hands. Jake didn't want to, but he overheard the teacher urging Ellie to turn down the volume because the noise was not conducive to learning. This is my house. I do what I want. If he doesn't like it, he should go to his own house. However, the noise didn't last long. Ellie had a snack and was in the kitchen again, this time wearing ultra-short shorts. What are you staring at? She snapped at Jake. Do you like me? Jake blushed. Where are you going? When are you coming back? Mrs. Fuller exclaimed anxiously. She didn't comment on her daughter's appearance, because it was apparently fruitless. None of your business, the girl retorted rudely, before slipping out the door. Well, we can now proceed with the lesson, Mrs. Fuller remarked sadly. Why? Why is she like this? Jake asked, clearly taken aback. After a moment he realized that such a conversation might be unpleasant for Mrs. Fuller. The teacher sighed sadly, sat down opposite him, and began to speak. You're mature now. You understand many things. I failed to raise my daughter properly. I teach other children, yet my own is out of control. Mrs. Fuller raised Ellie all by herself. She had never been married. Ellie's father was the kind of man who avoided responsibility, liked adventures and taking a risk. Fate somehow crossed his path with a quiet, modest girl who, for the first time in her life, had gone to a disco with her friends. What attracted him to her? Perhaps it was simply her difference from him, a sort of exotic allure. Being an experienced man, he could easily captivate a naive young woman. He knew how to be interesting, knew how to organize exciting entertainment. He tried on different roles and played them masterfully, enjoying himself. However, he disappeared after a week, as if he had never been there. The girl fell in love with him and spent a long time searching for this enigmatic man, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. He probably wasn't a local. The whirlwind, but short affair, left Mrs. Fuller with a daughter. At the time, I was even glad. I held on to the hope that he would return and see me with a baby. I thought his heart would be moved, and we would live together. Of course, I eventually realized that this was all wishful thinking. By that time, Mrs. Fuller had graduated from the pedagogical college and secured a job at the local school. However, she had to go on maternity leave, and money became tight. She lived with her mother, surviving on her mother's small pension and an even smaller child allowance. Mrs. Fuller then began tutoring. She spent her days in other people's apartments, instilling the granite of science into mostly indifferent students. Their parents were willing to pay generously for their children's education, but the children themselves lacked the desire. Mrs. Fuller had to overcome their reluctance and laziness, and sometimes even disgust. It wasn't pleasant, but it paid well. Ellie's grandmother cared for her, and was the first to notice the warning signs. She often complained, "Ellie is too willful, always restless, and doesn't listen to me. I discipline her, but she's indifferent. Today, she deliberately cut up my favourite sweater with scissors, just to spite me." She watched my reason while claiming it was an accident. "Mum, what are you saying?" Mrs. Fuller tiredly retorted. "She's only 2.5 years old. What revenge? What disobedience? She's just exploring the world, that's normal." Mrs. Fuller cherished the moments when her daughter would run to greet her at the door each evening. The first thing the girl would do was to rummage through her bag, looking for treats, and she always found a chocolate bar, sweet fruit or flavoured buns. Mrs. Fuller tried to please her daughter. After all, who else would? She had no father. Time passed. Ellie started kindergarten and Mrs. Fuller began teaching at the school again. This transition brought new challenges. Ellie's educators began complaining about her disruptive behaviour. She lied, fought with the other children, provoked boys into pranks, and was generally disobedient. Mrs. Fuller promised to address the situation with her daughter. At home, however, Ellie behaved like an angel, leading her mother to believe that the teachers and her grandmother were unfairly maligning her. Then Mrs. Fuller's mother suddenly passed away from a heart attack. It was terrible and dark time for Mrs. Fuller, but she had... So from now on, Mrs. Fuller alone brought up Ellie, who was about to go to the 1st grade. It was then that the woman had to admit that something was amiss. Ellie was adamantly refusing to learn and showed no interest in reading, writing, or performing basic arithmetic. Mrs. Fuller worked tirelessly with her daughter, patiently tolerating her tantrums and complaints. Only threats seemed to work. Read this page, solve these math tasks, and then you can go outside. Otherwise you will stay home. Ellie was desperate to avoid being confined indoors, which felt like a prison to her. She would yell at her mother, call her names, and throw her textbooks against the wall, but she ultimately had to comply with her demands. At that time, Ellie was physically weaker than her mother. As she grew older, Ellie began to push her mother aside, venturing out into the streets or sneaking around while her mother was at work. Mrs. Fuller couldn't keep an eye on her daughter around the clock. Occasionally, Ellie would not return home from school, choosing instead to roam the neighbourhood with questionable friends. Mrs. Fuller was deeply concerned for her daughter, but was at a loss about what to do. Neither prohibition nor locks. Ellie lied, disrespected her mother, and even stole valuables from their home, presumably to sell for spending money. Mrs. Fuller first noticed the smell of cigarettes on her 10-year-old daughter, and by 13, Ellie had come home drunk. Mrs. Fuller tried talking to her daughter, warning her of the dangers that awaited her on the streets, but Ellie merely smiled condescendingly at her mother, dismissing her warnings. "What do you know about a free life, about the street?" she retorted. "You've spent your entire life fulfilling the wishes and expectations of others. I don't care what people say. I was born free, and that scares you. I am nothing like you." Ellie disturbingly took after her father, whom she had never known or seen. She was the same easy adventurer, the same liar, the same actor, the same adventurer, rejecting the rules, just like him. Mrs. Fuller struggled to steer her daughter away from this path, hoping that education could conquer genetics. She sought help from psychologists and psychotherapists, tried to befriend Ellie, and sought to instill more willpower in her. However, all her efforts were in vain. As Ellie grew older, the gap between them only widened. Their relationship was starkly different from the bond Mrs. Fuller had with her own mother, which was filled with mutual support and shared interests. Ellie seemed to resent her mother for her mundane, simple life and intellectualism. The girl herself considered herself an ideal. She could afford to do what she wanted. For example, to swear at the teacher in class because the teacher was critical of her appearance, or to smoke right on the school porch. "Maybe it's just her age," Jake suggested after listening to the teacher. The pain in Mrs. Fuller's eyes was so deep that he felt compelled to offer some comfort. "That's what I hope. Puberty will pass. Ellie will calm down, come to her senses, and think about the future. My fear is that something might happen to her in the meantime. But we're getting off track. You need to study. Open the textbook to page 38. Jake visited Mrs. Fuller every Sunday. They rigorously prepared for the competition while enjoying fragrant tea and deliciously homemade pastries. They also engaged in fascinating conversations. Mrs. Fuller was careful to answer all of Jake's questions, never dismissing a single one. She emanated wisdom and empathy. At times, Ellie would be home during these lessons. One day, she barged into the hallway. She reeked of alcohol and tobacco smoke, her legs unsteady. It was late morning, and it seemed like Ellie hadn't been home the previous night. The girl passed out in the hallway. Jake assisted his teacher in moving the unconscious Ellie to her bed. "That's how we live," Mrs. Fuller sighed later. "Nothing seems to work with her." Ellie was even more challenging than the aggressive girls from the orphanage. Those girls were hardened by their difficult circumstances and the need to fight for survival. But what about Ellie? She had everything: clothes, her own room, and delicious food. Most importantly, she had such a wonderful mother. Once, Ellie insulted Mrs. Fuller in front of Jake. The woman had merely asked her daughter if she would be back for dinner, and already irritated, Ellie lashed out with an angry tirade at her. Unable to bear such words, Jake stood up for Mrs. Fuller, who didn't deserve such treatment. But Ellie jumped up and slapped Jake so hard that his vision momentarily went black. "Are you going to tell me what to do in my own house?" Ellie's eyes blazed with a menacing fire. From then on, Jake thought that Ellie was crazy, sick, and once Jake confided in his teacher about his suspicions regarding her. "No, there's nothing wrong with her psyche. When Ellie was still agreeable, I took her to several psychiatrists. The diagnosis was unanimous. Everything is within normal limits." Jake never discussed Mrs. Fuller's difficult daughter with anyone else. The teacher didn't ask him to keep it a secret, but he decided it himself. The only exception was Alberta. They always shared everything with each other. "Ellie doesn't realize how fortunate she is." Alberta shook her head. "If only I had a mother like hers." As the contest date approached, a major problem surfaced. The participants had to fund their own transportation. This included tickets for the child and a guardian, hotel accommodation for several days, and meals. "No, I can't afford such an expense." The orphanage principal immediately rejected the idea. "We need to fix the roof. Many of the children have outgrown their warm clothes." Jake overheard Mrs. Fuller trying to persuade the principal. She argued that Jake's participation in the competition was his chance at a normal life. She also pointed out that the potential benefits for the orphanage if Jake won. "You'll attract many sponsors after this. The roof will be repaired, the children will have new clothes, and a sports ground will be built." "But he has to win for that benefits. What are the guarantees?" "He has a lot of potential. I can't believe our student will outperform everyone at an event of this magnitude." Jake heard every word and suddenly felt a chill. Due to financial difficulties, he might not even compete. Had all his practice, effort, and hope been in vain? He had a goal, a dream, and now it felt like it had been yanked away. "I'll figure something out," Mrs. Fuller reassured Jake, who was struggling to contain her tears. "Don't worry, we'll find the money. We'll attend this contest, you'll see." Since then, Mrs. Fuller had been relentlessly approaching the administration and even city businessmen. However, it seemed no one believed in the talent of the boy from the orphanage, and her proposals fell on deaf ears. Jake appreciated his teacher's endeavours, but he had already come to accept that he would likely fail. It seemed inevitable. Yet she managed to secure the funds. One morning before lesson, Mrs. Fuller approached Jake, who usually arrived before everyone else. "We're going," Mrs. Fuller informed Jake, her eyes shining with joy. "I've managed to find the right amount of money." "Where? How?" The boy felt his heart pound in his chest like a trapped animal. "There are still good people in the world," the teacher vaguely explained. Only on the eve of their departure, Jake discovered where Mrs. Fuller had taken out money. As usual, he visited his teacher on Sunday. He hoped he wouldn't run into Ellie, but unfortunately she was home. "What's up, nerd? Are you happy about going to the capital?" Ellie sneered at him. "My mother took a loan out because of you. It would be better to buy branded sneakers for her daughter, but no, she'd rather spend her money on some nonsense like your useless contest. She's pissing me off on purpose." "Mrs. Fuller, have you done this for my sake?" Jake asked his teacher. Blushing as if embarrassed by her actions, the woman replied, "Don't think that way. I've wanted to go to the capital for a long time. Plus, this is a great opportunity. The principal will increase my salary after your victory. It will help me pay off my loan. Everything will be all right." After hearing this, Jake made up his mind to win, no matter what. He couldn't let Mrs. Fuller down, and indeed, he won the contest. Standing on stage under the spotlight, he felt calm and clear-headed. The theme was challenging, almost a misfortune, but Jake delivered a monologue that earned him a long applause. The results were to be announced the next day. Mrs. Fuller was anxious. "Objectively, you were the best, but we can't ignore the possibility of favouritism or connections," she warned. Jake wasn't among the initial laureates. Third place wasn't his. Second place still wasn't his. As Mrs. Fuller looked hopefully at the stage, Jake had almost accepted defeat. But then the presenter called his name. The hall erupted in applause. First place! Victory! Everything happened so quickly that Jake barely had time to comprehend it. When he returned to the orphanage, he was hailed like a champion. Alberta wept tears of joy, and Mrs. Fuller beamed with happiness that everything had turned out well. Soon after, representatives from a boarding school for gifted children came to take Jake. They spent a couple of days settling formalities, preparing documents, and learning about the boy's past. Jake realized he was being taken to a new life, one he deserved, according to Mrs. Fuller. He now had a promising future. Jake was set to become strong, intelligent and wealthy. He had won the golden ticket, thanks to Mrs. Fuller's efforts and Alberta's support. Saying goodbye to them was difficult. They were the closest people to him. Alberta was worried about his departure. How will she cope without him for the next years? Who will protect her? Mrs. Fuller promised to take care of her. Still, the thought of being away from his loved ones was daunting for Jake and filled him with longing. However, Jake knew it was worth the temporary sacrifice. After a few years, he would become a successful and affluent individual. He was determined to make it happen. Then he would express his gratitude to Mrs. Fuller and ensure that Alberta lived a life akin to a fairy tale. Jake managed to achieve the second goal, but not immediately. Initially, he spent 3 years at a boarding school for gifted children. It was like a palace, complete with a luxurious garden, private rooms, and state-of-the-art classrooms. He was surrounded by intelligent, motivated peers, and it was here that he made friends. They had a lot in common, and friendships naturally formed. The teachers at the boarding school were attentive to their students' abilities and worked to nurture them. These were knowledgeable and approachable people, and interacting with them was enriching. However, Jake did not form as close a bond with any of them as he had with his former teacher. He often thought of Mrs. Fuller, hoping she wasn't struggling with paying that loan or being mistreated by Ellie. After graduating from the boarding school, Jake was admitted to a prestigious university. He received scholarship, accommodation in dormitory, and continued guidance from mentors. As a student, Jake found employment with a good salary, and he could finally visit his hometown. The young man eagerly anticipated seeing Mrs. Fuller and Alberta. There was no problem in finding Alberta. The principal of the orphanage gave the address of the apartment where the girl lived after graduating from the orphanage. The apartment was a dismal, tiny place in an old, shabby apartment building on the city outskirts. Alberta had graduated from sewing school and was working as an assistant dressmaker in an atelier. "I thought you'd never come back." Alberta's eyes sparkled like stars upon seeing Jake. "You've changed so much." "I couldn't leave you," Jake responded, embracing Alberta. "I've missed you so much. You won't have to live here anymore, not even for another day." That same evening, Jake helped Alberta move into his parents' apartment. It remained empty all this time. Knowing that Alberta would be living in better conditions gave him peace of mind. Moreover, the thought of a loved one living in his childhood home brought comfort. As for Mrs. Fuller, she could not be found. Her apartment was now occupied by new tenants. "The owner sold it to us 2 years ago," said a woman in a robe who opened the door to Jake. "She and her daughter moved to the country, I heard. I don't know the details, and I don't need to." Jake returned to the capital to continue his studies and work. However, he went back to his hometown during every vacation, where Alberta was waiting for him. After graduating, Jake started working at the diplomatic corps. He was immediately offered a responsible, high-paying position. As Mrs. Fuller predicted, his victory in a prestigious competition became his ticket to a successful life. Now, Jake's life seemed to be following a carefully planned path. Everything seemed to fall into place automatically. Jake bought an apartment in the capital, and Alberta moved in with him. They got married. Despite the demands of his job, Jake steadily climbed the career ladder. Alberta enjoyed her role as a mother and a wife, and Jake made several attempts to find Mrs. Fuller, but all were in vain. Her whereabouts were lost after she moved from her old apartment. Jake deeply wanted to thank her again and show her his accomplishments, to prove that her efforts were not wasted. He believed that such a kind woman deserved more than just verbal gratitude. Years later, Jake realized his job in the diplomatic corps was consuming too much of his time and energy. He was missing important and joyous moments in his life. He missed his son's first day at school due to an urgent meeting, and his daughter's first ballet performance because of crucial negotiations. So, he decided to venture into the restaurant business when the opportunity arose. And now, Jake was looking at the woman near the trash cans and couldn't believe his eyes. This resemblance was unnerving, but surely the poor woman couldn't be Mrs. Fuller. His teacher had a home, a job, and presumably a pension. "Hello, Jake," the woman greeted him with a sad smile. "So, that's how you've grown. You've become handsome, grown up, strong, just as I once dreamed." "Mrs. Fuller?" Jake queried, struggling to believe the situation. The woman nodded in affirmation. Jake invited her to go into his office, and on the way, they both expressed their joy at the chance meeting, each in his own way. Mrs. Fuller smiled warmly and a little embarrassed, while Jake told her excitedly about his life and how long he had been looking for her. Once in his office, Jake gestured for Mrs. Fuller to sit on the cosy sofa in the corner, set aside for guests. He then prepared coffee for her, serving it with a plate of cookies. "Mrs. Fuller, it's just a miracle that we've met. I've thought so much of you and have been searching for you for so long. I wanted you to see what I've become, thanks to you." "Thanks to yourself," corrected the elderly woman, looking at Jake with pride. "Talented, persistent, hard-working. These qualities have led to your success." "You must realize that if it weren't for you, I don't know what I would have become." "You'd still be a good man without me, and you would still be successful, albeit perhaps not so soon. I can tell when a kid has a backbone. Trust me, I've had a lot of experience." "But why do you—" Jake hesitated, choosing his words. "How did you end up in this situation? It's clear that you're in need, and—" "It's clear that I've become an old beggar. Speak straight," sighed Mrs. Fuller. It was evident that she was uncomfortable in front of her former student, ashamed that he saw her in this state. "Can you tell me about it?" "All right," nodded Mrs. Fuller. "It's a long story, and its ending isn't unexpected for me. Everything was leading up to it." After Jake was sent to a boarding school for gifted children, Mrs. Fuller started facing severe problems with Ellie. The 16-year-old girl began spending nights at unknown places with unfamiliar people, often returning home only in the morning, or sometimes several days later. Occasionally, the police would bring her back after Mrs. Fuller sought their help, since Ellie was underage. Mrs. Fuller tried everything to control her daughter. Pleas, threats, heartfelt discussions. But Ellie remained unaffected. Mrs. Fuller even tried to lock her in the house when she went to work, but Ellie, craving freedom, once escaped through a balcony by tying sheets together and descending from the 4th floor. After this incident, Mrs. Fuller stopped locking her daughter in, fearing for her safety. Ellie now only communicated with her mother using harsh language. All valuable items in the house, including Mrs. Fuller's modest jewellery and household appliances, mysteriously disappeared. Once, someone even took the washing machine, while Mrs. Fuller was out. Ellie needed money for her entertainment. Mrs. Fuller, who had tried to instill a love for books, theatre, and learning new things from an early age, was devastated to see her daughter having no other interests in life. Sad mother partially blamed her daughter's friends' negative influences for her troubles. Teenagers from dysfunctional families who neither studied nor worked were Ellie's best friends. Mrs. Fuller saw representatives of this society, glassy, absolutely empty heads, the stamp of limitation on their faces, ungroomed, always some grey and ragged, and these people somehow had a great influence on her daughter. Ellie's young body couldn't handle the strain and she was hospitalized a few times. Doctors warned that if she continued down this path, the results could be fatal. The terrified mother decided to take drastic action, moving her daughter to a village. She planned to sell their apartment, buy a house in a remote village, and remove her daughter from the harmful environment. She believed that the fresh air, physical labour, severed ties, and a change of scenery would help Ellie come to her senses. It was hard, leaving everything, selling the apartment, with no guarantees that Ellie would get better, but I had to try. I had to do something. Did you take her to the doctors? Of course. I even managed to get her into a clinic once, but she ran away and then refused to see any specialists. She was content with everything and didn't see herself as sick. You can't drag a girl like that into the right life with a lasso. Initially, she refused to move to the village, so Mrs. Fuller had to go alone. The woman was at a loss. She had initiated the move solely for her daughter's sake, and yet Ellie found a workaround and stayed in the city, living with someone from her company. Unfortunately, the mother herself pushed her daughter to become even closer to these. But then Ellie returned, angry, skinny, and dishevelled, quickly becoming like the people she enjoyed spending time with. Mrs. Fuller knew her daughter was living with her friend, but apparently the crowded apartment, lack of money, and constant shouting and quarrels didn't suit Ellie as well. Needing a place to live, a frustrated girl returned to her mother, who would always provide food and a clean bed. Mrs. Fuller felt a slight relief because her plan to bring Ellie back on track worked out. Unfortunately, nothing like that. It didn't take long for Ellie's old friends to start visiting the village, and sometimes she'd travel the 150 kilometres to visit them in the city. Moreover, sociable Ellie found a similar crowd in the village. She began frequenting a house with an unkempt garden, a leaky roof, and a woman with 3 children from different men who hosted endless parties. One day, Mrs. Fuller noticed her daughter Ellie's rounded belly, indicating that she was pregnant. "What's the big deal? I'm 18 and have the right to be pregnant." Ellie shrugged when Mrs. Fuller shared her suspicions. "And who's the father? Is he from our village?" Mrs. Fuller inquired. "No, he's from the city. But honestly, I don't remember his name or what he looks like. We met at a club," Ellie replied, reminding her mother of her own youthful indiscretions. Mrs. Fuller clutched at her heart, while Ellie smiled, enjoying the shock she'd given her mother. Despite her pregnancy, Ellie continued with her usual lifestyle, drinking, smoking, and disappearing into the city or the village house. Her mother's pleas to stop drinking fell on dead ears, as Ellie seemed indifferent to the fate of her unborn child. "None of your business." This was the sole response Mrs. Fuller received to her pleas. Her grandson Tommy was born prematurely. He was incredibly small and frail. His mother, Ellie, was rushed to the maternity hospital from the street when she began to experience contractions. The baby was born weak and ill, and stayed in the hospital while Ellie was discharged. Once free, she returned to her old lifestyle, leaving Mrs. Fuller to visit Tommy and consult the doctors. Tommy's condition was dire. Ellie's lifestyle during her pregnancy had negatively impacted him. Underdevelopment of most organs and systems, heart defects, the doctors said, and added that if the baby survived, he would be a disabled individual requiring lifelong care. His life expectancy was also likely to be short. Ellie was determined to write a refusal on her son. "Why do I need him? He's an invalid. and I'll have another baby, a healthy one." Mrs. Fuller was horrified by these words. She tried to convince her daughter that this was unacceptable. After all, he is a living person. To the elderly mother's relief, Ellie changed her mind. She decided to take Tommy home after her friend gave her some advice. This was the same woman in whose house the village drunkards used to hang out. "There are allowances for children. If he's invalid, it's even more money." That was the advice. Tommy was discharged. His arrival didn't change Ellie's lifestyle. She continued to live freely, coming home only to eat and sleep in a comfortable environment. She was receiving Tommy's allowance, which made her even more popular among her friends. Mrs. Fuller stopped trying to reason with her daughter, finally realizing it was futile. She didn't blame herself for what happened to Ellie. She knew she had given her daughter enough time and had done everything she could to raise her properly. It was not her fault she had failed. Now Mrs. Fuller dedicated herself to Tommy, providing his medical care, aiding in his development, and taking him to the doctors. People, including doctors, wondered where the child's mother was and why this grandmother was raising him. But Mrs. Fuller lied to everyone, claiming her daughter was working hard to provide for her son, and she, the grandmother, was just helping the young mother with her disabled child. No, the woman was not ashamed of her daughter's behavior. She had stopped fearing people's judgment long ago. Her fear was different. She was afraid that her daughter might lose her paternal rights and that her grandson Tommy would be taken away. It was unlikely that he would be left with his grandmother due to the poor living conditions, her advanced age, and her meagre income. Therefore, Mrs. Fuller played this play out for her grandson's sake. Then Ellie brought home her husband, a grown man with reddened, clouded eyes from constant drinking, and announced he would now live with them. Mrs. Fuller thought things couldn't get worse or harder, but she was wrong. This man, Alejandro, made her life a living hell. He dashingly emptied the refrigerator, not caring about its filling. He did not care that these fruits or milk Mrs. Fuller bought for Tommy with her last money. Alejandro never cleaned up after himself, would shout at Ellie and Mrs. Fuller if something displeased him, and sometimes even resorted to violence. To make matters worse, Alejandro's friends began visiting their home regularly. It was intolerable. They would stay up all night in the kitchen, swearing, laughing loudly, filling the house with cigarette smoke, clinking glasses, and sometimes even fighting. Tommy tossed and turned in his sleep, while Mrs. Fuller sat beside him. She was afraid to go to sleep. What if there was a fire or something? No, she had to be on the alert. Ellie, however, was content with everything. "I couldn't leave. How could I leave Tommy with them?" Mrs. Fuller wiped away sudden tears. "Tommy, he loved me. I was his only hope. I endured all of this for his sake. I would have left a long time ago. In fact, that's what I did when Tommy—" The disabled boy was predicted to live a short life from the very beginning. Yet Mrs. Fuller clung to the hope of medical breakthroughs and the power of modern medicine. At first, the baby seemed to be doing well, but then he caught pneumonia, which was fatal to his poor health. Mrs. Fuller went to the hospital with him. Then the child was transferred to the intensive care unit. And then he died. Mrs. Fuller wept for days after the doctors had delivered the dreadful news. Ellie and her friends also mourned, but their sorrow stemmed from the loss of their income source. "Well, we'll have more babies," she shrugged in the end. "It's not a hard thing to do?" Alejandro grinned. Upon hearing this conversation, Mrs. Fuller realized she could no longer live with her daughter, this cold, terrifying, inhuman creature. "I packed my belongings and fled to the capital. My pension is small, and my daughter once took loans in my name. Now the bailiffs deduct from my pension. I receive hardly anything, but time is passing, and I'll soon settle all my debts. I live in a hostel with no space of my own, but it's preferable than enduring Ellie and Alejandro's antics. I often struggle to find food, so I walk near restaurants and cafes at night. Sometimes they leave uneaten food for the homeless. I didn't even know you owned all this, Jake. Jake shook his head, struggling to comprehend what he had just heard. Mrs. Fuller, a kind, compassionate, and talented teacher, was living such a terrible way. His heart ached for this remarkable woman. She didn't deserve such a fate, but things would now change for the better for her. Believe it or not, Jake began, I have been searching for you for a long time, just to express my gratitude. Now that I've found you, you will have your own cozy, clean apartment, similar to what you used to have. You're an excellent teacher who loves your work, and people need your knowledge. I have friends whose children require extra lessons. They would be enormously thankful for a tutor like you, and they'll pay well, trust me, so you can work part-time as a tutor if you like, of course. I don't want to impose on you, Jake. Consider it a repayment of a debt. It must have been challenging for you to pay off the loan you took out to send me to the contest. And honestly, this help is no burden to me now. I'm just happy. I also want you to meet my children, and my wife, Alberta, will be delighted to see you. Mrs. Fuller smiled as she looked at her former pupil. Yes, I'm also eager to meet your children and see Alberta. I'm so happy for you. Thank you, Jake. Mrs. Fuller was really glad. In spite of her bitter fate, she knew that now she might not have a white streak ahead of her, but certainly not a black one, as it had been before.